Introduction to Discharge of Contracts. 2 lessons ago, we talked about how to terminate a contract. Then, I mentioned that the best way to terminate a contract is for both parties to perform fully. In this lesson, we dive more deeply into the many ways a contract can end, or, as the lawyers like to say, how a contract is discharged. We can discharge a contract in 5 major ways. A contract can end in some other, less common ways, but the 5 we are going to talk about are the major methods for discharging contracts. The first way is when the parties mutually agree to end the contract. The second is when the parties fully perform their respective obligations under the contract. The third way occurs when unexpected events make a contract impossible to perform. The fourth way is when an operation of law renders the contract unenforceable. The fifth way is when a party breaches the contract and a court order discharges the contract with or without a damages award. We're going to talk about each kind of discharge in turn in this lesson. But before we do that, let me tell you a story. Ernesto owns a movie theater downtown called the Vista Theater. The Vista is a lavish Art Deco theater built in the 1930s. The lobby is full of mirrors and lights, and the theater hall boasts 4 huge crystal chandeliers. In the last few years, ticket sales at the Vista have been falling. Ernesto blames it on binge watchers staying home to stream television series. Whatever the reason for the falling sales, Ernesto decides to sell. He's losing money on the upkeep of the theater and he wants out. He lists the Vista at a sale price of $1 million. Maya learns that someone plans to open a new museum just a couple of blocks away from the Vista, called the Museum of Movies. Maya believes the Vista's sales could snap back with the museum nearby. She believes movie fans attending the museum during the day would love to catch a movie in the evening at the beautiful Vista. She agrees to buy the Vista from Ernesto. They draw up a contract with the closing scheduled in 6 months to allow Maya time to get financing. Will the story have a happy ending? Let's find out. Agreement of the parties. Imagine Maya spends some time looking for financing, but she just can't find anyone willing to lend her the amount she needs. Imagine that in the meantime, Ernesto gets to thinking about the new museum and decides that maybe the future isn't as bleak as it seems. Maya comes to Ernesto, distraught, and tells him she's having trouble finding financing. Ernesto says, "Hey, why don't we call the whole thing off?" Can they do that? Yes. Those who agree to be bound can also agree to be unbound. To do this, the parties must make a new contract, a binding and enforceable agreement that the original contract will no longer be enforceable. The new contract, however, will require a mutual agreement and consideration, just like any other contract. What is the consideration for agreeing not to enforce the original contract? The answer depends on how much the parties have already performed. If neither party has begun to perform, then consideration for a discharge by agreement is simple. Each party's waiver of the other's performance obligation is the consideration for the agreement. Let's go back to Ernesto and Maya for a moment to make this point clear. Under the contract, Ernesto and Maya each hold a legal right. Ernesto can require Maya to pay $1 million to buy his theater, and Maya can require Ernesto to convey the theater to her for $1 million. By giving up their respective legal rights to require the other to perform, Ernesto and Maya will each experience a legal detriment. And legal detriment, you may recall, is consideration for a contract. Voila! Mutual agreement and consideration. Discharge by agreement before performance is the simple case. But what if one of the parties has already started to perform? This situation is trickier because just calling off the contract after performance has begun would unjustly enrich or detriment one of the parties. For example, imagine that instead of selling a theater to Maya, Ernesto is building a theater for her. If Ernesto completed half the building and Ernesto and Maya wanted to call the agreement off, Maya would receive half a building and Ernesto would receive nothing. In this case, both Ernesto and the courts would expect Maya to pay Ernesto something before discharging the contract. That something Maya pays would be the new consideration for Ernesto not suing on the original contract and asking the court to order her to pay damages. When the parties agree to discharge a contract, the legal result is that the original contract becomes unenforceable. If a party sued on the old contract, the defending party would point to the new discharge contract. In many ways, you can think of this whole process as novation, the replacement of an existing contract with a new contract, where you are changing the obligations instead of changing parties. Full performance. By far, people's favorite form of contract discharge is full performance by both parties. Everybody gets what he or she expects out of the contract. Everything is resolved. Life is good. The parties go their separate ways, mutually enriched and free of obligations. So, who declares the contract discharged? A formal announcement may not happen. In the case of an executory contract, a contract yet to be performed, the contract is alive because parties are expecting performance to occur. If a party breaches the contract by failing to perform, the non-breaching party can file suit in court to enforce the contract. Both parties know this. This pressure of expectations keeps the contract obligations in the parties' minds. But once full performance occurs and the parties' expectations are met, the executed contract is dead in the sense that nobody is expecting anything further to happen. If a party sued on the contract, the court would dismiss the case because the parties had completed all their obligations. The contract no longer governs the parties' behaviors. Even without a formal discharge, the contract is discharged by virtue of having served its purpose. The parties move on. Sometimes one party believes they have fully performed and the other party disagrees. If the unhappy party files suit, the court will consider whether any contractual obligations remain. In such circumstances, the court may decide that a party has substantially performed the contract, which means the party has performed to such a degree that, although the performance may not meet the exact requirements of the contract, the performance is close enough that it's unreasonable to require a party to perform any further. The court may or may not award damages if substantial performance exists, but the court will rule that the contract is complete and discharge it. Courts often apply substantial performance in construction contracts, where the finished building may be suitable for its intended use, even though it varies from the contract's exact specifications. Impossibility of performance. A contract can also be discharged if the contract becomes impossible to perform. But impossibility will only apply if the parties play no part in creating the impossibility. Let's go back to our Vista sales scenario. Imagine that a few days before closing, the Vista burns down. Only some melted chandelier crystals remain. Ernesto breaks the bad news to Maya. The vista is gone. What can Maya do? Can she demand that Ernesto rebuild the vista with all its Art Deco details and convey the property to her? No. The law would consider that unreasonable. A court would say that the contract has become impossible to perform because the primary object of the contract, the theater, no longer exists. In this case, the court would excuse both parties from performance under the contract and discharge the contract. This result is consistent with common sense. When Ernesto and Maya made their deal, neither imagined the vista would burn down. Requiring Ernesto to deliver a 1930s Art Deco theater he lost in an accidental fire offends our sense of fair play. However, if Ernesto had set fire to the vista on purpose, the court would not discharge the contract based on impossibility because Ernesto caused the fire. Instead, the court would probably explore potential damages and try to compensate Maya for any losses she incurred prior to breach. This, too, comports with common sense. Our sympathy for Ernesto evaporates if we learn that he set fire to the theater himself. Impossibility usually applies when the property involved in a contract is destroyed accidentally. But it can also apply in personal services contracts where a uniquely qualified person becomes incapacitated or dies. For example, a performance contract for Lady Gaga would become unenforceable due to impossibility if she unexpectedly died. Nobody could replace Lady Gaga as the performer. Sometimes, parties will plan for surprises by including a force majeure or act of God provision. These clauses provide plans for what the parties will do in the event that unforeseen events make performance difficult. The parties might agree to delay or excuse performance, or they might agree to replace the original obligation with some other obligation. If a contract contains such a provision, then the contract, not the impossibility rule, will control what happens. Operation of law. Operation of law can also discharge a contract, usually by making the contract legally unenforceable. For example, a new law may declare previously permitted conduct illegal. Any contracts for the now illegal conduct would become unenforceable because the contract now has an illegal purpose. When it comes to operation of law, a statute of limitations is very important. A statute of limitations is a law that requires people to bring legal actions and claims within a specified time. If the party waits longer than the time permitted by the statute of limitations, the courts will dismiss the suit out of hand. This is the ultimate you snooze, you lose law. The statute of limitations encourages parties to bring legal actions promptly. Resolving disputes early usually produces better results. Memories are fresher. Evidence is easier to come by. In addition, the statute of limitations creates finality. By closing the door on old claims, the statute helps people rest easy knowing those claims will not return to trouble them. Every state has a statute of limitations for contract claims. The limitations period for contract claims varies by state. It is as short as 3 years in some states and as long as 10 years in others. But 6 years is a common limitations period for contract claims. For contract cases, courts usually measure the limitations period from the date of breach. Once the breach occurs, the limitation clock starts ticking. The non-breaching party must sue within the limitations period or run the risk of the court finding the contract legally unenforceable. A legally unenforceable contract is a dead contract. it can't make anyone do anything. Breach. Lastly, a party may bring a lawsuit in response to the other party's breach. This lawsuit may produce a final court order that awards damages and discharges the contract. After such a discharge, the contract has no further legal effect. Contract remedies. If a party breaches and the non-breaching party sues, a court can impose many remedies on the breaching party or on both parties if necessary. The court's goal in applying remedies is to restore balance to the contractual relationship, not to punish the breaching party. The most common remedy in contract cases is compensatory damages, also known as expectations damages. The idea behind compensatory damages is simple. The court tries to put the parties in the positions they expected to be in if the breach had not occurred. For example, imagine Jonas mows Walter's lawn for an agreed $50. But after the mowing, Walter says the job isn't worth $50 and only gives Jonas $30. In this case, a court would order Walter to pay Jonas another $20. In the end, Jonas would have $50, which is what Jonas expected to get for mowing the lawn. The court's compensatory damages award places Jonas in the position he expected to be in if Walter had fully performed. Specific performance is another important contract remedy, particularly in real estate sales. With specific performance, the court orders a party to do whatever the contract requires the person to do. A court will award specific performance if money damages cannot compensate the non-breaching party for the breach. Specific performance is appropriate when the contract involves sale of a unique item that cannot be easily replaced, such as fine art or custom-made items. Courts often place real estate in this category as well. For example, if Ernesto balked at the closing table because he decided Maya was right about the future of the Vista with the Museum of Movies nearby, it is likely that a court would order Ernesto to perform the sale. The Vista, its architecture and location, is a unique building, and by ordering specific performance, the court can ensure that Maya gets the benefits of her bargain in a way that simple money damages would not provide. However, courts usually won't order specific performance when a contract involves personal services or when prolonged monitoring and supervision of the performance would be required, as, for example, with a construction contract. A court may also issue an injunction. An injunction is an order directing a party to do something or not to do something. In contract cases, courts usually issue temporary injunctions early in a contract dispute to maintain the current situation between the parties and give the court time to hear the case. However, a court may also impose a permanent injunction at the end of a case. Usually, the party seeking an injunction must show that they will suffer irreparable harm if the court does not grant an injunction. Reformation is another remedy a court may apply. Reformation is appropriate when the parties have made a contract, but they've done a poor job of writing down what the contract actually requires. The goal of reformation is to reshape the parties' contract to align with their original intent. In reformation, the court is not trying to impose new conditions on the parties. Rather, the court is trying to clarify the parties' respective duties and provide them with an enforceable contract that reflects those clarified obligations. A court may also rescind a contract. In rescission, the parties return to the positions they held before they made the contract. Discharge by mutual agreement is a self-help version of rescission, but rescission may also be court-ordered. A court may award rescission when a contract fails at formation or becomes impossible to perform. In the case of a court-ordered rescission, the courts may order one or both of the parties to perform restitution by returning anything of value they received during the contract performance. Restitution prevents a party from being unjustly enriched when a contract is rescinded. If the parties recognize that their contract involves duties or obligations that may prove difficult to value in the event of a breach, they may include a liquidated damages provision in their contract. A liquidated damages provision specifies how much will be paid in damages in the event of a particular event, like a breach or an unforeseen event. However, a court may decide not to enforce a liquidated damages provision even if the parties include one, if the court decides the provision is punitive. As I mentioned earlier, the goal of contract remedies is to compensate non-breaching parties for contract losses, not to punish breaching parties. If a liquidated damages clause looks more like a punishment or penalty than the reasonable compensation for loss resulting from breach, the court may refuse to enforce the provision. A court may examine a liquidated damages provision closely if the parties had unequal bargaining power during negotiations. Courts are most likely to enforce liquidated damages provisions when the contract involves matters that are difficult to value, when the liquidated damages look like reasonable estimates of the potential loss, and when the parties have equal bargaining power. In your career as a real estate agent, you'll see many contracts come and go. Remember that each contract has a lifespan, moving from formation to discharge. Some contracts live a long and happy life and retire after full performance, content with memories of a life well lived. Others crash and burn because they are formed badly from the beginning, doomed to lack any legal effect at all. Hopefully, what you've learned in this chapter will help you understand the lifespan of every contract you encounter.